Welcome to Washington Policy on the Go. My name is Donald Kimball. I am the communications manager for Washington Policy Center. Thanks so much for joining us today. This, of course, is our series where we're bringing you the latest news, particularly right now with legislative session fallout and other policy in Washington, the most important reforms and news happening that affects you in your life. Today, we're going to be talking with Mark Harmsworth, our small business director, about both the rent control bill that Governor Ferguson signed, as well as his yet to be signed budget, whether or not that's going to see any substantive changes or not, what to expect there. So thanks so much for joining. As a reminder, if you are watching this on YouTube, give a like, give a share, and a subscribe. It helps us out a ton. It really helps our reach, and we are so appreciative for all that. And leave a comment what you think. We also love to engage with the comments. We read those and check those out. And if you're watching live, there is the Q&A function in the bottom where you can ask questions during the show here, and we will try to address those. And if you don't catch this live, you can, or if you have to leave early, you can find this on YouTube. It should be up later today or at the very latest tomorrow. So without further ado, thanks so much, Mark, for joining me. Welcome back to the program.
Thanks for having me on today, Donald.
Okay, so let's start with the big news from last week, which was Governor Ferguson signing, I believe it's HB 1217. I think that's the number. And this, of course, is a bill that you had talked about leading up to this. We'd been covering this pretty extensively, and it did make it past the finish line. Governor Ferguson, along with a slew of other housing-related bills, signed this rent control. They call it, of course, rent stabilization. They don't want to use the term rent control because that is political poison, rightfully so. But let's talk about it because, I think a lot of people, a lot of business people, a lot of economically minded people understand that rent control is not a good thing, but it's not always the easiest to break down as to why this hurts, right? When you're having a casual conversation with someone, they think, well, now a landlord can't raise their prices like 20% year over year, so people are safe. Why is that a bad thing? So talk me through this bill. Maybe its provisions, because it has had some changes from its initial version. What are those changes? And then maybe just like an overview of sort of your thesis from your blog you wrote earlier. Great blog. Go check it out at washingtonpolicy.org for more. So talk me through that.
Well, the original bill that looked like it was going to move came out of obviously the final bill was from the House too, but the original bill came from the House, and it was a limit on the amount a property owner can raise rents each year, which is they limited it to 7%, and they put a bunch of other restrictions on there around notification and how you literally they're giving you templates if you're a property owner on how you need to notify your tenant on how rent is going to go up. So at 7%, you think, well, that sounds like a lot of money, but when you start throwing in as an example, the property tax is increasing, the cost for sound transit car tabs and all these different things that affect the cost of running that house, including the fact in Seattle specifically. They had huge backlogs on evictions. So if you ended up as a property owner with somebody living in the property that maybe did their first and last and then didn't pay any more, you have to kind of factor that into the cost of renting the property. And for folks that don't rent property, you typically will pick 1 or 2 months that you're not going to be able to rent the property as you transition to maybe a new renter at the end of the year and what have you. You throw that cost in there too. So on one hand, you've got the state who's pushing from the bottom. They're trying to raise prices on you as far as taxes and all the different fees, and you think garbage collection, all that kind of stuff. And then on the top end, the state now says, oh, by the way, you can't raise prices any more than this. You start squeezing that margin. Now, property owners that are renting property are not doing it out of the good of their heart in 99.9% of the time. They're using these properties either as retirement income or they're using it as investment income, which ultimately they will probably roll into a retirement investment, capital investment, which they then use to live off of. So when that margin gets squeezed to a point where it's just not worth it, or the risk and instability in the market goes up significantly, you end up in a situation where you're just not going to make any money on these rents on these properties, and the risk is way too high. And the result will be that property owners will sell the properties because that's one way they can get around. Hold your water, don't tell the Democrats this, but that's probably what they're going to come back with next year and say, if you sell the property, you can't, or excuse me, if you evict the tenant, you're not going to be able to raise rent for another year to get around that issue. But that's what's going to happen. And I'm already seeing in the blogosphere and through conversations I'm having with people, both on the property development side and on the rental side, is people are pulling out of Washington state because of this specific bill. Now, the final incarnation of this wasn't quite as bad as 7%. It went to the Senate introduced a 10% plus CPI. And then the compromise bill that eventually passed was a 7% plus CPI. So that's kind of why it's really bad, because although like you said, hey, you can't, I mean, 7% sounds like a lot, especially when you throw CPI on there. But then if you have a duplex and the roof fails and you have to replace the appliances, you get a bad renter, or you get somebody who doesn't pay rent for a year, and that happens a lot. You get somebody get in there. Or in the case in Seattle, what I was hearing is some other property owners that had multiple units, they were getting folks first and last, and then they would Airbnb the apartment out themselves, the rental would, and it was so hard to get them out because every time you showed up, um, a different person would be in there, and you're like, who are you? So they're effectively subleasing the thing, and they're only there for 3 days. So by the time you can't file anything, and the backup in Seattle was almost a year at that point, and so they were basically saying, well, 33% of my rental properties are vacant because I can't take the risk. So you can see how this can be a huge problem when you start adding in instability in the market with rent caps.
Yeah, it seems to me like the problem they're trying to account for is the rent or excuse me, the property owners who want to raise rent to an unreasonable degree. Say someone wants to raise by 15% because they're wearing the monopoly top hat and they're clutching he I'm an evil greedy landlord or something like that. And that's not to say these people don't technically exist. Sure, there might be some people like that. But it seems to me, from my perspective, and correct me if I'm wrong, that the people that are more likely to engage in that behavior are the larger companies that have a bigger sort of control over a region where there's less competition from individual actors. They're also the ones who can sort of afford this kind of cap easier than the individual landlords. The person who maybe only owns one or two properties, like you said, is doing this for retirement income. And so by driving those smaller players out with this legislation, you're giving the very people who are more likely to find other ways to extract prices, find other ways to drive up prices, whether again that's holding off on renting a space for a little while so that then they can jack up the base price. So you're not, raising rent on the same tenant, you're just kicking someone out early, or you're holding it off on the market because you have such domination of a region or whatever it is. It seems like you're consolidating all of that to the very people who are the potential bad actors that you're trying to weed out. Am I missing something here?
No, and they've got more lawyers too, and more money to
Right.
pay the lawyers. If it's mom and pop who maybe they so they're renting their first home. They were able to save some money, get into a second home. You can see that that's maybe very difficult for them because they don't have deep pockets, and when things go bad, they're not presented with the same number of options as some of these bigger players. I'm not hacking on the bigger players. I'm just saying
Sure. It's just
it's a
maybe
different behavior.
exactly
You know.
incentives. Yeah.
Yeah, and the number of times I've spoken to friends that are renting homes, both apartments and houses from other people, and maybe that's their only property that they're renting. They've said that they typically don't increase the rents because they like a good renter in the home. In fact, one renter that I spoke to, he maintains the property mostly because he wants to live in a good spot, and in response, the owner of the property hasn't raised his rent in 8 years. Now, with the rent cap coming through, you've got to assume that you're going to see some renovation of the properties. You're going to see some catastrophe, water heater exploding, flooding the basement, yada, yada, yada. So you're going to have to increase the rent by the maximum every single year and build up a basically a contingency fund, because if you don't have that contingency fund and something big happens, you're not going to be able to afford to replace it unless it's coming out of your own pocket. And then what you'll see there is they will kick the tenant out, repair it, and sell it to recoup the money that they just put into the home. Again, taking that property off the market either into the private market space, or into a larger consortium of folks that we've just talked about.
Well, you're exactly right, and I can speak from personal experience. I had a couple of roommates. We rented a house in Newcastle, great area. Rented it from a couple who, again, I think they maybe had two or three properties that they managed, and every year they raised the rent by 2%. And they'd come by once or twice a year to do some of the yard work, to maintain some of the roofing stuff. They do it themselves. But we had a great relationship. We took care of the place. They only raised it by 2%. Now, even if they had no plans on raising rent further, if we were still there, it's likely it would be a 4% increase or a 5% increase, maybe not even the cap, but more than it would otherwise be, because you have to consider you don't know what's going to happen down the line. Maybe us good renters, like we did, we got different positions in life. We got different people got married and moved out. So you have tenants that aren't reliable anymore, or maybe the dishwasher's going to flood and break and you have to think about that. So even for the people who stay in the market, even if you're not maxing out at the cap, which many will, the unseen cost is the increase that you would not otherwise have had to lay in. And that, of course, just drives the floor of rent everywhere upwards.
Mm.
And speaking of driving that upwards, that's another thing I was curious about, though, is the bill. What is the likelihood of the cap, that 7% plus CPI, being brought down in a future legislative session?
Um, Pretty much guaranteed, given the makeup of this legislature. I would see them attempting to remove CPI next year, or drop the percentage as well, because there was obviously a desire on the House side, at least, to see a 7% base. And that will just exasperate the problem. We have a real world concrete example of what happens with this. The newly elected president of Argentina, they had rent control in place. And when that went in place, I think it was 2018, 2019 that first went through, they saw a huge reduction in the inventory of rental properties. And now, obviously, Argentina was going through a very inflationary period of time. So, but it's all relative. But they saw an increase, and I just put this up in the blog here. 2018, 2019, the average rent was around 18,000 pesos per month, ran up to 334,000 pesos per month. Now, if you just not had rent control and just did inflation, even though their inflation was so much higher, that would have only gone to 210. So you saw immediate number of properties coming off the market, and then an increase in rent that was much higher than the cost of inflation. Now, when the new president gets in there, he says no more rent control. Immediately, they saw a 40% increase in available properties. Some folks are saying up to 170% increase in available properties, depending on which articles you're reading. And they've seen an average 30 to 40% reduction in rents the moment they took rent control off. Now, I hope we don't get there. Um, and I hope that cooler heads prevail in Olympia, and they decide that they want to reverse this rent control policy, because we've seen this. We saw it in San Francisco. We've seen it in Minneapolis, and it puts the market, which is already under duress, under more strain. And the solution to this isn't rent control; it's increasing available inventory, and we can do that through relaxing the Growth Management Act and relaxing some of the permitting requirements that the state forces onto property developers.
Yeah, I can't remember what country it is off the top of my head, but it might be a Scandinavian country. I can't remember. They have sort of a rent control type system, a rent stabilization like we do. And a lot of advocates of this kind of policy will point to them and say, look, they aren't. It's something like half of the government is, or I think half of the market is government owned. That like manually sets the price at a certain way or rate. And they'll point to this, say, look, you can stabilize rents, you just have to get government involved. But the other half of the story is the building. So that government also massively, since that policy was enacted, expanded their building, and that kind of leveled it. So prices kind of stayed stable, but that's only because they were massively expanding the housing. There are a lot of other problems where you talk to people on the ground over there, and the way to get into the government stabilized price control housing is by knowing someone. And frankly, I don't want our government policies to work best when you know a guy. That doesn't seem like a good way to run a society personally. But that's the other piece here really is that building aspect. And to that end, I did feel like it was sort of two steps backward, one step forward with those bill signs. I'm putting you on the spot a little bit here because it just came to mind, but were there any highlights from the other bills that he signed? Because again, the purpose of that signing day was to try to get affordable housing. And so along that, this was not the only bill that was signed. There were other things that were being signed alongside this. Anything good or bad coming out of that in addition to this? Also, just as a reminder, if you're watching this, there is a Q&A function if you got questions for Mark.
Yeah, there was a bill that gave us tax relief on ADUs, which are accessory dwelling units. And for those that are not aware of this, last year the legislature passed, or the year before that maybe, some rules that allow you to build accessory dwelling units in your yard, depending on the size of your yard. Now, it's kind of a two-edged sword because some folks move into neighborhoods and they want them to be single-family neighborhoods, but there's appropriate use for this. And in some areas, particularly around, if you think Highway 99 in North Seattle, or down some of the Tacoma area down there, there's appropriate use for ADUs, and especially if you got huge lots. Additionally, this year, and so they put a tax exemption in for that as well. So that's great. Additionally, this year they passed a lot splitting bill, which, as long as you meet the setback requirements of your lot and some other bits and pieces, that lets you then build a second house, on your property. Oh, that will increase, that goes directly to the point I made earlier. That will increase housing supply, which is what we need. There were some other bills that went through that I thought were quite good, around zoning for cities, for a city to be able to annex in an area just outside of its city limits with some restrictions on environmental regulations, but that would have allowed a city to maybe create some new single family home dwelling or whatever zoning is therein. There was some legislation that was passed that allows residential in commercial areas, which hasn't been the way before. So you can think a warehouse downtown being redeveloped as a fancy condo apartment complex or something like that. There were also some other things as well, which I did not like. Some of the preemption around high density on transit lines, that the state can now come in and say to the local city, nope, no, we're going to do it my way, the state's way, and not the way the people in your city would like to do it. So there were some good, bad things there. But overall, I think the legislature on both sides was trying to solve the root issue, but just very differently. On the Democrat side, it was, like you were saying, let's take out all these greedy property owners that aren't greedy, with a couple of exceptions, I'm sure. And then on the Republican side, it was more about increasing supply, because that's ultimately, in a demand supply capitalist environment that we're in, that's the way that we can reduce housing costs, which is exactly what you saw happen in Argentina once they started reinvesting in their housing. And I do want to talk a little bit about the government owning your house. My grandparents lived in a house that was owned by the government. And the problem with government owned housing is initially everything's great because it's new construction. Everyone's happy. They go like, hey, if you want to go see what this looks like, go drive down the I-5 corridor, 164th, near Linwood. You got these sort of Soviet style apartment blocks that don't look too bad right now, but you can see where they're going to deteriorate over time. That's exactly what happened to my grandparents' house. It deteriorated over time to a point where the government realized it couldn't afford to repair and maintain those homes anymore. So it turned around and sold them at a loss back to the private market. Back, typically you could buy your own home back from the government, which they ultimately did, and made some investment and repaired the place so they can
That
actually live in it.
that is
So
such a foreign concept for a state government owners. I'm doing a little bit of
yeah,
study on municipal broadband right now, and why does that sound so familiar? I'm
yeah.
just shocked.
So it just doesn't work.
Yeah.
The it's kind of like when they quote you the price for Sound Transit light rail. Oh, it's only this much money. Well, you completely forgot the capital cost, the construction cost, the eminent domain you're going to have to use to take people's homes away to put that light rail in. You're not factoring that in. And when you do, it comes in around $287 per rider that's being subsidized on the light rail, I'm sure.
Plus every delay adding, plus inflationary costs because of the
Yeah.
delay, et
Plus
cetera.
your increased healthcare costs to
Yeah.
deal with
Yeah.
fentanyl stabbing. So
Yeah. Well, that's a factor that I think every government policy needs to have in play there. Okay, well, thank you. Yeah, I was gonna say, I think if I'm not mistaken, I think also Germany had nationwide rent control for a year. They removed it. Um, and I think every person who has actively lived in rent controlled apartments or buildings has that exact same experience of the government owned housing, where when you have a now again, what we have is rent control. It's not a no increase, so you do have a little bit of wiggle room for some of those improvements. But when you keep lowering that threshold, when you keep lowering that cap, and eventually eliminate it, then you get into the exact situation you were describing with government owned housing. And so this rent control step is a step toward that government owned housing, essentially, where there's no incentive to upkeep these buildings, and there's no way that you can afford to as a developer. Okay, so let's move on to the budget. Before we do, there's a question here that kind of I think is a nice lead-in. Steve asks, "What critical bills are remaining to be signed or not signed by the governor? I thought he had only 20 days to sign or not sign bills. Seems like we are beyond that time period." To address the latter part, we're not. I believe that you had mentioned that's this weekend, though. Is that right?
yeah, it depends when you measure it from, whether it's 20 days after the end of session or um, uh, when when they hit sine die. So there's a little confusion, I think. But basically, it's this weekend. It's Friday or Saturday this weekend. He has to sign them by, and the big one, obviously, that he has not signed yet is the budget. Um, and if you are not aware, I'm just going to pull some numbers off the screen here. 77.8 billion in appropriations. That's a 6.5 increase over the 71.9 billion. And all these numbers are in biannum. So this is what they spend in a 2-year period. And that's a 9.3 billion increase in spending. That's the operating budget. That doesn't include capital transportation, which rule of thumb approximately doubles the price at the end of the day. The capital budget is money that the state borrows from issuing bonds to go build schools and roads and that kind of stuff up front, and it has to be repaid. So there's a loan there, and what happens is the moment a 30-year bond has been repaid, they issue another 30-year bond to cover up the same cost because they have a certain bonding amount. Um, so there's quite a lot going on there. Education drove the biggest increase in spending, about 33.6 billion. That's a 7% increase. We would like to see, particularly for K through 12 education, report cards and measurements in outcomes, because we're slipping as a state. We're falling down compared to the other states, we're falling down. An increase of 12 billion for healthcare and social services. Medicaid was the one that took most of that. The rest of it is in just general human services. There was some climate expenditures. I just saw that Todd ranked, put a post up this morning, says we're ranked 50th now in the nation on our environmental outputs, and yet we're spending so much money on this, which with the Carbon Commitment Act. So if you're at the pump, you're now going to be paying another 6 cents, which passed as part of this budget. But the Carbon Act is adding anywhere between 40 and 50 cents per gallon right now. And then State Patrol got some more money, which is great. I'd like to keep that rolling there. Transportation did some. They had them refocus on existing projects. We certainly have a maintenance issue that we need to deal with. And then when we're spending over $100 billion on light rail, which represents just a fraction of a percentage of the trips taken, rather than spending it on the roads and fixing the roads, it's kind of a mixed result there. So there's a bunch of things in here. The disappointing thing is really after COVID, when the legislature opted to use one-time federal dollars and to start programs, and then turn around to us and say, oh, we can't cut these programs now, but we don't have any money to run them anymore. This is where a lot of these increases are coming from, plus just increase in government spending. They've hired 8,000 new employees in the last few years. And really, are you getting effectively this budget in the last 8, 9 years has almost doubled? Are you getting double the services? We haven't doubled the population. So why has it gone up so much? Well, it's waste, and a lot of this, I did a quick search on DEI in the budget and found $130 million worth of DEI expenditures without even looking. It wasn't that hard, and so there's a lot of money going into different things in this budget that really doesn't need to be spent.
Well, and you know what 130 million in the state budget could have bought? It could have bought a ferry, a much needed ferry in 2018. However, with the executive order that Jay Inslee signed that required hybrid electric, the quotes have just come in. I just saw this pop up, so I thought we would just talk about this right now since it is kind of breaking. And there are two bids that we've gotten back, and the cheaper of the two is a company out of Florida, which the bid for a hybrid electric ferry would be 251 million, so roughly double what we paid for our last one. And a Washington company had an even higher bid, and I want to say it was 359 million. I could be mistaken there, but about there. So that's one area that Governor Ferguson has said we're going to delay implementation of this executive order so that we can get more ferries in service while still looking at that for down the road. Do you see a possibility of him doing other kinds of things like this when it comes to this budget? Because as it stands, this budget would still be the largest tax increase in Washington state's history.
I think so. I'm cautiously optimistic, based on what Governor Ferguson has said over the last 4 or 5 months, that there's some things in here I think that he doesn't either wants to delay or doesn't want to fund, and so he has the ability to veto these things. And I'm hoping that he stays true to his word about, hey, it's not about new taxes. It's about we're going to have to make some cuts. Now, did they make some cuts? Very little, but I'm hoping that he can go through this and start looking for some of the cuts in some of these tax increases that they've been talking about. The B&O tax, it's a 25%. For those of you who don't know, I own a small company. It's 25% tax increase on me. The sales tax on services for different things is a huge impact to the cost of things, and it all gets passed down. It's not like if you throw a 10% tax on a small business or a medium-sized business, they're not just going to eat it. They're going to take that and they're going to monetize it through the cost of their products and services. So we all end up paying more anyway. So it's not really a tax on business. It's a tax on consumers. And you just have less money to spend, and it suppresses economic activity. So I'm hoping that he looks at some of these more gnarly taxes. There's a cap gains increase of 2.9% on everything over $1 million. That's huge for business owners where their business is their retirement, and they're going to sell it at some point, or pass it on to their kids, and they're going to get hit with an additional 2.9% cap gains right off the top. Now, if you have a 401k, good for you. But there's a lot of people out there that don't, and their investments, their homes, their rental properties. That's a 2.9% tax on a rental property when you sell it. That's literally 3% out of your pension, which means one less martini a week or whatever it is you do in retirement. I don't know. You golf and drink martinis is what I've heard. So
Yeah, well, it's true. I mean, my dad built a small business in Washington. He worked his life here building it up to be success, and now that he's planning on selling it soon, the capital gains tax punishes him in that way over all of these things that he's paid taxes on throughout his entire life. It feels very punitive, and it's not over these mega wealthy Bill Gates types. That's it. It's, I mean, my father's successful. He's done really hard work, but he's not like, bathing in a gold-studded bathtub or anything on a yacht out there, right? Like, so it very much feels misdirected, and I do hope that Governor Ferguson does take sort of a scalpel to these. It feels, we were talking a little bit earlier, it feels a little bit like the example that I like is when TV writers for a show want to include something profane, they'll add in extra. Maybe they'll add in 6 cuss words, and then the network comes back and says, well, we can't have 6 cuss words here, we'll cut 3 and you can have 3, and that's what they wanted originally, right? And it feels a little bit like that's what the legislature did, where they proposed a massive, I think again it was like 12 billion in new taxes. Governor Ferguson said that's unacceptable, and they came back and said, well, now it's only 8 billion. Maybe that's what they're trying to play at. I hope he sees through that, because 8 billion is still 8 billion in new taxes, the largest tax increase in Washington's history.
Yeah, that's a considerable amount of money for every single taxpayer in our state. And the small, when they start talking about small businesses that make over 1 million or large businesses, $1 million is 5 employees. You're
Yes,
talking about a retail store. You're talking about the little roof company down the street that's got maybe 3 roofing guys and the owner. They'll clear $1 million in a year because it's all based on gross. And so when you see that, what you will start to see, unfortunately, I think, is business owners looking for more favorable tax environments and either moving completely or moving at least their registration. And then guess what? The state of Washington doesn't get the tax dollars. It just increased and it just made the problem worse. And if you think it's just not just small businesses, look at what Jeff Bezos did last year, moving his residence to Florida. You've got others that have already said, like Nick Hanauer, not known for his conservatism, saying this concept of these cap gains taxes and these wealth taxes specifically he was speaking about just don't fly because you're mobile and once you just move. That's what you do to get away from it.
absolutely. Well, I want to tackle some of the comments and questions we have from the audience just to answer the last part of the first question that we got, because I realized I forgot to address that from Steve. Some other bills that we are keeping an eye on that have not yet had action. Elizabeth New has written a blog where she's tracking 3. So Senate Bill 5041, which is the payment of the unemployment insurance fund to striking workers, that has not been signed. He's not indicated whether or not he will. We're hopeful, though not expectant, of action there, that hopefully he will reject that. The Parental Bill of Rights undermining bill, House Bill 1296, that has not had action yet, so we're keeping a sharp eye on that one. We also hope he will reject that. And she also listed Senate Bill 5083, which is a price cap on insurance, or I think it's behavioral health and hospital services. Also, hope he rejects that. I personally am a little skeptical based on his willingness to include price caps in the rental market. Not seeing the economic illiteracy of that, I tend to think he might not see it here either. But again, hopefully he will reject that. So those are 3 examples of bills that we're still waiting on. Are there any bills that you know of that you're aware of that you're tracking other than I think these are kind of the last few that we're waiting on, the budget being the big one.
Yeah, I was following rent control on the budget mainly. So
Okay.
the budget's got so much in it as far as appropriations and
Yeah, well,
provisos.
following the budget is kind of like
Yeah,
following 50 bills, to be fair.
yeah,
So
it's 1,300 pages of stuff. So
yes. Okay, so the other things that people wanted to mention, let's see here. Let me pull up the question here. So the regular gasoline in Oregon is 80 cents per gallon cheaper, and their roadways are in similar condition. The carbon tax is being used in Washington to convert homes and businesses from gas to electric heat. How does that improve our roads? Well, it's a very simple answer from what I can see. What do you
it
say?
doesn't. Yeah, it
Exactly.
doesn't. My furnace is dying a death right now, and I just got a quote to replace it, and I don't know if I want to replace it in case the judge stays on this natural gas ban thing, but we'll see what happens. But it just drives up the cost of everything. Yeah, if they took the money they're supposed to, and so the state typically, like carpool lanes is an example of this in transportation. Originally the state says, "Oh, everyone can use this lane," and then they convert it to a carpool lane, and suddenly you can't use it. But when they built it, they could use gas tax. Now, gas tax is constitutionally protected, has to be used for the roads, which is why they're pushing so hard on the RUP charge, which thankfully died this year. That's the road usage charge, that's the pay per mile scheme, because that would not be constitutionally protected. Although if you ask any of the proponents of it, they are very cagey about whether they want it protected or not. They don't, because then they can use it more for transit. So if you take a lot of the sound transit stuff, like if we were to recombine the sound transit budgets and the Department of Transportation budgets, there's plenty of money here to fix the roads. They're just spending it on inefficient ways of moving people around. I don't dislike buses. I think the trains kind of stupid for the amount of cost that we're putting into it, and it's not a real train. I was driving over I-90 on Sunday. I noticed it's limited to 40 miles an hour, whereas a bus, you could have driven that over I-90 and driven it at 60 miles an hour and had multiple buses, whereas they can only have one train on there one time. So it's a very inefficient way of moving people if you're into public transportation. Plus migratory patterns of people. A train is fixed. A bus you can reroute based on where people are actually traveling. You think that the bridge traffic is reversed in its intensity over the last 20 years between Redmond and Seattle, depending on who's fashionable, Amazon or Microsoft. So
Well, yeah, well, and then like you were saying earlier with the sort of the compounding costs, of course, increasing gas costs means increasing anything coming into the state costs. So literally completely non-connected products will be more expensive because of the cost it takes to bring them in. It's just
yeah, diesel, by the way, was 12 cents
yeah, that's right.
a
A
gallon.
couple of comments here. So James points out that the governor has 20 days after the session, not including Sundays. So it ends on Tuesday the 20th,
Oh, yeah,
technically. So
that was the misread I saw as well. People weren't sure whether you included the weekends or not.
yeah, exactly. So that's for some reason not Saturday, but Sunday's exempt. So thank you for that clarification. And then also a clarification on the original proposal was 21 billion in new taxes, and they settled for 12.5 billion with the state plus local being divided. So good clarifications there. I'm just sort of speaking offhand to illustrate
And
the
this
point,
is
but it's even
James,
scarier.
the James Troyer, right?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Okay, he's now smiling at me.
Yeah. So let's see here. We also have a question. Did Governor Ferguson sign the bill forcing medical treatment if mandated by the state? I don't know specifically what bill you're referencing. If you're talking about there was, I
Yes,
think it's
yes, he
ESHB
did.
1531. Yeah. Is that the
Yeah,
one we're talking about? Yes,
yeah,
he did sign
he
that.
signed that one, unfortunately.
Yes. Okay, let's see here. And then will you discuss the property tax issue and estate tax issues, please? The property tax bill proper got rejected, but then rolled into the budget. Is that correct?
Um, no, the original bill was to remove the 1% cap. They did. I'll talk about if I remember correctly, the estate bill went through, and it changed the amount you pass. It increases the amount that you can pass on as far as capital gains. So it's a little bit better from that perspective, but it hurts. I think it hurts your income earlier on. If they're referring to the removal of the 1% cap, the constitutionally passed
Hmm.
1% cap, that did not go through.
Okay.
So they were originally looking at everything up to, and remember there's bank capacity as well, 3%, 4%, and that type of thing. Thankfully, that did not go through. That
Yeah,
was
3%
toxic.
that could be banked. Exactly. To highlight what you said there. That
Yeah,
could roll on. If you didn't raise it this year, you could retroactively add.
yeah.
Insane.
So you would have seen some fairly substantial, and it's kind of an odd setup because if you're a fiscally responsible city council and you don't increase rents each year, or it's not rents, excuse me, property taxes by 1%, and then you bank maybe 5 years worth, and then maybe the focus of your council shifts for some new members, and suddenly they're like, hey, we've got 5% here, so they bang, you got a 5% property tax increase in 1 year. So it's an interesting way we're set up right now. A lot of the municipal depending on how they're spending their money, are struggling, and others are not, depending on how fiscally responsible they have been, and if it's and if something's happened that's required them to do that, to go and to raise the taxes that much here. I'm just double checking on that bill you sent me
Yeah, yeah,
earlier.
of course. So one thing and if I'm not mistaken, the property tax that got defeated there, that Governor Ferguson actually came out and said he would reject it. And
Yes.
I want to thank everyone here and just around Washington because we set up our petition on a pretty quick turnaround. That petition to submit our signatures to the governor, we have over 36,000 people signed on to this to say we do not want these tax increases. And after that pressure is when he came out and opposed like that property tax increase. So, not saying we're the only ones, but your voices are actually impacting. Again, we have a governor who seems a little bit more open to standing up to some of these whims. Our prior governor was a little bit more of a rubber stamp on kind of anything legislative. Tax increases that were put in front of him. Seems like our governor here is at least a little bit more open to listening. So thank you guys for doing that. It actually makes a difference. And to Tanya's comment, I'm discouraged about the happenings in Olympia, but I'm really appreciate these lunch meetings and that keep us up on everything. Like, we're really grateful for engaged citizens, because the reality is a lot of people want to run, they want to flee, but sometimes bad ideas are described as a disease, and diseases are communicable. And you look even at somewhere like Idaho, and you'll hear Idahoans complaining about things like, yeah, well, we're starting to get these bad ideas over there. And I truly think that if, we can't stand up, even in a place like Washington, and start pushing back, it's just a matter of time before it spreads. You have to defeat bad ideas at their source, or else it's just inevitably going to encroach further and further out. So thank you guys for being engaged, because without people like you who are paying attention, who are sharing this with friends, it's a lot harder to keep that fight up. So we're extremely grateful for your engagement. Any updates that you had on the state or anything else, Mark?
No, I'm not seeing it there. So
Okay, great.
I know he's signed the bill that allows the state during if there's another thing, COVID
Yeah.
scenario, he's expanded the powers there. So, and they're so vague, they could start forcing you to do some stuff. So that's probably the bill that they're talking about there.
Yeah, exactly. Well, and it's one of those things where you look at any of the specific language and it says, well, this bill doesn't give any new authority for this. It just prevents local authorities from, pushing back against scientifically proved health measures. Like you said, very vague, very wishy-washy. If something like another COVID happened, I think personally that a lot of jurisdictions would start pushing back, and I think this is a bill to try to squash that. I would kind of hope that local authorities would reassert their own authority, because I think the more local control is a better prescription for these kinds of things. So, all right, well, thank you so much for joining us, Mark. Really appreciate it.
You bet.
Yeah, and we'll be keeping an eye on the budget. I'm sure you'll have something out when we learn. So be keeping an eye on our website at washingtonpolicy.org. Mark will have some new content there. Keep an eye on our socials as well. If I'm sure we'll have, like when the rent control bill was signed, we let that out know the moment it happened, with a comment from Mark and stuff like that. So stay in tune with our website and our socials for the latest. Thanks again.
Thanks for listening.
All right. Well, thank you. We're going to again have this. This show is every week during the legislative session. We'll see if we're going to keep that cadence. Usually year round, we sort of have it every other week, but there's just been so much happening that we've been keeping this cadence up. So we'll let you know if the schedule changes, but for now we're doing this weekly. Thank you guys again. If you want to share this after the fact with anyone that you think could benefit from it, make sure to do so. It will be up on our YouTube channel later today. And if you are watching this on YouTube, leave us a like, leave us a comment, and subscribe. It helps us out a ton. Thank you so much, and we'll see you on the next one. If you found this informative, share it with a friend, and consider checking out one of our suggested videos over here. Make sure you're subscribed so that you can stay up to date with the latest policy news from Washington.